Pacific sardines are an iconic Monterey Bay species. They're a small forage fish, so about this big, and they form dense schools, and those schools provide food for all sorts of animals. In the 1920s and 30s, during the beginning of World War II in particular, the sardine fishery here was booming. It was the third largest fishery in the world, right here in Monterey. In the late 1940s and 50s is really Mother Nature kind of pulled the rug out from the productivity of the sardine fishery. And what was once one of the most productive fisheries in the world really stopped producing. And so despite scientific warnings, and even once people realized there was a collapse, the fishery was really allowed to continue until they really couldn't economically even find any more fish. The fishery didn't come back for over 30 years until the 1980s. And so even though there were additional precautions built in and fishery managers were more careful, starting in around 2005 or 2006, there was a peak in the sardine population, almost to 2 million tons, as it was in its boom phase. Contrary to the past, though, most of it was being used to feed farm tuna and shipped offshore in these large frozen blocks to feed other fish. In addition to being used as bait, very little of the sardines were actually being used, put in cans. There was no canneries here, and very little was going to human consumption. So essentially a very inefficient use of the resource. Starting in 2006, the stock naturally started declining, and what we know now is that there was a lot of fish out there, but there was really just not a lot of production. We can see animals starving as a result of these declines, and unfortunately, despite scientists in the year 2012 coming out with a prediction that the sardines were collapsing, and the same thing that happened in the 1940s and 50s, the collapse of Cannery Row, was about to repeat itself. Fishery managers didn't listen to those warning signs, and fishing pressure actually continued to go up even as the stock productivity and the stock numbers went down, and we basically saw a repeat of Cannery Row. 2015 stock assessment showed that the numbers had fallen so low to the point where it was below the cutoff population, or the threshold under which a fishery was not allowed to operate. Oceana saw that information and brought that to fishery managers with a request for an emergency closure of the fishery, which ultimately federal fishery managers voted unanimously to do, and the fishery was closed only a couple weeks after. Now, it could be worse. If they hadn't shut the fishery down, the population probably would be at much even lower levels. If you look out and go out whale watching, or you love looking at birds, or you love eating a nice plate of fish at a seafood restaurant, sardines are much more important to you than you may realize, because none of that would be here if those fish, those birds, those whales didn't have enough to eat. And so that's really why some of the smallest fish out there in the ocean may be some of the most important.